In this video, we'll begin to look at half reactions. Half reactions are when we split up a reaction into an oxidation reaction and a reduction reaction. So we should have two halves, an oxidation half and a reduction half. Remember this picture from before? We have zinc. It's an atom of zinc, and it's giving 2 electrons to a copper ion. So what should happen to the charge of zinc? If it gives up 2 electrons, zinc will now have a positive 2 charge, and copper ion gains 2 electrons, so now its charge should be neutral. Keep this cartoon in mind. Electrons traveling from zinc to copper. Okay, here we have the same thing. This is a bar of zinc, of solid elemental zinc. And in the solution, we have an aqueous salt, copper 2 sulfate. So we have copper ions floating around. Just like we saw in the previous video, in the previous slide, electrons will be transferred from zinc atoms to copper ions. So what happens to the zinc atoms when it loses electrons? And what happens to the copper ions when it gains electrons? That's right, it looks something like this. The zinc, when it's lost its 2 electrons, it entered the solution as zinc plus 2. The 2 electrons that it lost, remember, were transferred to copper plus 2. So copper plus 2 gained 2 electrons, and now it's solid copper. It's no longer in the solution. So zinc was a solid. It entered the solution. Copper was in the solution, and it became a solid, all because of the transfer of electrons. So zinc lost electrons. It got oxidized. Copper ion gained electrons. It got reduced. Let's look at this maybe as if it's under a microscope. So here's our zinc bar. Here's our solution of copper ions. They're floating around. Remember, these have a plus 2 charge. So these zinc atoms here are going to be losing 2 electrons. And these copper ions should gain the 2 electrons. So here we go. Look at this zinc. It gives off 2 electrons to this copper. Now, copper is no longer an ion, but it's a solid atom of copper. And this zinc atom that was here, well look, when it entered the solution, it lost its 2 electrons. So zinc, in the process of losing 2 electrons, enters the solution. And copper ion, in the process of gaining 2 electrons, becomes a solid. So these are a couple cartoon pictures, but here's what it looks like in real life. This is the zinc bar, and this is the blue copper 2 sulfate solution. So the copper begins to accumulate as a solid, and the zinc begins to dissolve. So let's examine the reaction that we just saw. Remember, zinc is transferring electrons to copper. So zinc was a solid. Now zinc is going to be aqueous. And the copper at the beginning was aqueous, and then it becomes a solid. If you recall net ionic equations, the things that are aqueous can be split up into their ions. So we can also split up zinc sulfate into its ions. And then, as you recall, in a net ionic equation, we can cancel out the items that appear on both the left and the right. So let's cancel out sulfate on both sides. So here's what we're left with. Zinc turning to zinc plus 2, and copper plus 2 turning to copper. So this is our reaction. We're going to split this up now into an oxidation half reaction and a reduction half reaction. So let's look at zinc. Remember, zinc is losing 2 electrons. It's going from 0 to plus 2. Copper has a charge of plus 2, and it's gaining 2 electrons and then going to 0. So in this case, zinc is being oxidized. Zinc goes to zinc ion, and copper ion is being reduced, turning into elemental copper. And once again, this is exactly what we see in the cartoon. This is a solid piece of zinc giving 2 electrons to the copper ion. When the copper ion accepts those 2 electrons, it will become elemental copper. And this zinc that's lost 2 electrons will become ions of zinc, and they will float around in the solution. So here's what it would look like over time. All of the zinc has dissolved, and the zinc is in here floating around as ions in the solution. And the copper that became a solid, well, that's all at the bottom. You can see this bluish color, it dissipated over time. So the copper's at the bottom, and the zinc bar is now dissolved.